Today, we're going to look at 3 different beginner-friendly basic styles of painting and thinking about what you want to do for your first miniature. Hey everybody, welcome to Mob Hammer 40K. I'm Mob, and today we're going to get back to painting basics. I recently got back into the hobby earlier this year, and I leaned more heavily towards the low opacity, much more translucent paints such as Games Workshop's contrast paints. And I was scared to go back to using the more traditional paints that they had because I just couldn't thin them down right. I just always felt like it was kind of gloopy, it took me way too much time, and I just didn't have the confidence for it. As a painter and a hobbyist, I think it's important to be comfortable with different painting styles and be willing to experiment because you never know which situation will call for which technique or which type of paint. Today, we're going to look at 3 different beginner-friendly basic styles of painting and thinking about what you want to do for your first miniature. The 3 styles are traditional paint, contrast paint, and slap chop. These should get you thinking about how the paint will be applied to the model, how the different paints will treat the surfaces differently, and get you just thinking about how you can use them in your toolkit when painting your miniatures. First things first, we're going to start with the traditional style. For the first step, you're going to need to prime your miniature. In this case, I would recommend Vallejo Black Copy Spray-On Primer. Just be sure to give it a vigorous shake before applying. Then, you'll need to select your base color for the miniature. Oftentimes, the pigment and medium become separated like seen here. In order to maintain consistency, you'll want to shake it up either using a paint mixer or shaking it yourself. An essential tool in your hobby journey should be to get a wet palette. It will help you thin down your paints as well as allow you to keep painting longer. Of course, you can't paint without a brush. I recommend getting at least one synthetic Kolinsky brush from your local art store. You can also purchase various sizes which come in handy for painting smaller details. When loading up the brush, check the consistency of the paint and make sure it has a fluid, milky consistency. Add tiny amounts of water as necessary. Another optional tool is a painting handle. This will help with palm fatigue over long hours of painting. Begin applying your base color in smooth, thin coats, building it up over the entire model. Do not worry about painting over details that you may paint a different color. We'll be adding those on top later on. Something you'll notice about the paint is how shiny it looks going on. But when it ends up drying, it will look quite matte like here. Next, we're going to start adding some of our metallic paints. For my first one, I'm going to start with gold to get the shoulder blade edges and the aquila on the chest. At this point, you may also want to switch to a smaller/longer brush, just to help with picking out the tiny details. Also, here's a pro tip when doing detail work. Sometimes your paint will go where it shouldn't, so always have a second brush handy that you can douse in water, then apply it to the area where you accidentally painted. Then, dry the brush either on your hand or on a napkin and erase the residue paint from the area. Just be sure to be quick, otherwise the paint will dry. So, don't be too afraid when getting into the nooks and crannies. You will make mistakes, but that's all part of the process. Now we're going to add a silver paint. This will be used to pick out details on the jump pack, the gun, and the in-between armor bits. If you are unable to erase your mistakes, again, do not fret. We'll be covering these up. Nobody's perfect, and there's a lot of tiny details to pick out on these miniatures. Going back to gold, I pick out one more final detail on the gun. Now, we're going to be adding some of our secondary colors. Regardless of whether you mix your paints or not, sometimes dropper bottles just get clogged, as seen here. Don't be afraid to clear out the clog with a pin or a set of tweezers so that way it flows nice and smooth onto your wet palette. Holding our breath and taking our time, we slowly begin to add the eyes onto the face. Grabbing our next secondary color, leather brown, we begin to pick out the pouches and the gun holster. Having almost forgot, I grab red to pick out the seals. As a final secondary color, I use bone white to color in the parchment paper attached to that seal. Going back to my base color, Goblin Green, I go over the miniature and fix any mistakes I had prior. As a final step, I grab a black brush-on paint to clean up extra paint spills on the base. This is just a very basic step to help your miniature look neater. Overall, I really enjoy this style of painting just because of how forgiving it is to clean up messes, plus it's also pretty cost effective. You just gotta make sure to thin down your paints, otherwise you will run into issues with losing details on your miniature and getting a gloopy paint effect. Now it's time we move on to our one coat / contrast paint method. You'll want to use a white primer this time. This is absolutely essential if you want your base color to have any vibrancy. When choosing your base color, there is a range of costs when it comes to one coat paints. In addition, availability of certain brands can make it hard to find what you want. For this video, we're going to be using Vallejo's Express Color line. In addition to Kolinsky brushes, you'll want a shading brush. The shape is slightly different than Kolinsky's, allowing for it to hold more paint in the bristles. That being said, you want to be careful not to overload the brush up to where the bristles meet the stem. One coat paints can cause separation in the bristles if it reaches the base, ruining your brush over time. Since the Express Color is already watered down, I use a non-wet palette, load up the brush, and get to town on the miniature. You're going to notice just how much brighter and shinier the Express Color paint is. I don't mind laying on a little extra thick because when the excess paint settles in the crevices, it will create a nice shadowing effect. Now we're back to pulling out our wet palette and applying the little details. We're back to using the exact same traditional style of paints we used for our first miniature in this video. Extra important to take your time and try to erase mistakes as soon as you see them. Because the Express Color is so much more translucent than traditional paints, they don't cover up what's underneath nearly as well. Luckily though, we've been practicing. It's super exciting to see how the traditional paints mix well with the Express Color base coat. It adds both textures and layers that we didn't necessarily get with the traditional style. You can see the level of vibrancy with this method, as well as the added texture throughout the miniature. That being said, it is certainly more expensive by the time you add a shading brush and more expensive contrast paints. If you start experimenting with different colors and doing this with different models or armies, you can see how that cost can exponentially grow down the line. And last but not least, let's talk about slap chop. You want to make sure you start with a black primed miniature. For ease of use, we're going to use a gray dry brush paint from Games Workshop, as well as get an inexpensive makeup brush with soft bristles at the end. Dry brush paint has a consistency that we haven't seen yet in this video. You want to remove any additional moisture by testing it on your hand or a paper towel before putting it on your miniature. You'll want to take your time building up the layer of gray, and ideally cover 80 to 90% of the black primer. The model should look like a muted version of itself, but it should now be much more easier to see the details. Next, we're going to move on to our white dry brush paint. You'll want to focus primarily on the parts of the model where light would be likely to hit it, i.e. the top of the model and the outer edges. Then we grab our old friend, the Vallejo Express Color, and put it into our palette. So here is where I messed up. When I started applying my Vallejo Express Color to the slap chop model, I put it on way too thick. And even though it's supposed to be a low opacity paint, when you put on that much paint, it ends up losing some of the transitions of the light white to the darker areas. You don't get as much of that gradient, which is what you're trying to get in the slap chop method. Because of this, I end up taking another model, dry brushing the gray and the white onto it, and then starting anew. I started applying the Vallejo Express Color. I add it in a much lighter layer so that way it doesn't pool. You can see just how the Express Color is interacting with the gradients here. You have lighter green on the outer layers and then darker green on the inside. After applying our base color, we bring back our wet palette to begin filling in the details. Similar to the contrast model, we have to be mindful of our mistakes. Hey, before we continue guys, just a reminder to please smash that like button as well as subscribe if you're not already. We're a young channel, so every little bit helps. Every like, every subscription, and when we hit 100, we will be doing a giveaway. So stay tuned, like and subscribe, and we'll have some goodies for you in the near future. Anyways, back to the video. The difference is a bit subtle from the one coat method, but there is a more realistic, gritty look to this model. Slap chop does require practice, but when you figure out your balance and use of white and gray, it can look great. That being said, when you are batch painting, the idea of dry brushing can be a bit boring and time consuming. In addition, the hand that's dry brushing can cramp up and hurt after a while. This is also much more expensive. Here is a quick side-by-side comparison showing all three styles. And in each of their own ways, they look great. Let me know in the comments which style you prefer or like the best. Keep in mind that with cost, you can save money on buying paint sets. The startup cost is certainly more expensive, but in the long term, it saves you money. I have now 3 fully complete Space Marines that were done in 3 different styles. I hope this provides a good introduction to really get you thinking about creative freedom with your projects. I hope this is less intimidating, that you can see that you can make something look good while still keeping it simple. Eventually work your way up to making it even better or more detailed. Whatever drives you, don't be intimidated by the amount of work or by failure. You learn the most by failing or making mistakes and correcting them. Take the time you need to learn, take the time you need to take a break from it, and dive in. What I need to do is actually dive in and finish my Leviathan box. I got a lot of gray in here and a lot of things I need to paint and experiment with. But as a friend of mine once said, it's not a pile of shame, it's a pile of attention. Looking forward to see you next time. Again, smash that like button and subscribe. I didn't do that smoothly, but I still think that was cute. I'm going to end on that. Bye!